Hey there, welcome back to the AtroKraft Satisfactory Megabase project. In the last episode, the base took a huge leap forward when petrochemicals came online. Turbofuel lit up the grid, and a permanent rubber and plastic plant turned constant shortages into steady supplies. This time, the focus shifts outward. The rail network is pushing into new biomes, stretching farther than anything we've built so far, and in the process it creates one of the first true landmarks of the base, a massive trestle across the Spire Coast. From there, the journey carries us to the Dune Desert, where construction begins on the Parthenon, a replica structure that will serve as both centerpiece and functional hub for the Endgame supplies factory. So let's get started. Rails through the coast, stone rising in the desert, and another step closer to the heart of the megabase. So this was going to be the first big push for the rail system, and it wasn't exactly planned down to the meter. It just started with a rough idea because I knew I wanted to climb the natural ramp that connects the northern forest to the rocky desert and claim the plateau above. But that meant carving a path upward and laying track that could handle the grade without feeling clumsy. Let's just say that it's in, but it's the sort of thing that will likely get torn up and redone later. Once that portion was complete, I swung the line back towards the starter base and re-entered it several floors higher than the old station. That extra connection started to pull the network together, giving the base another way in and out while opening the door for expansions to come. Now that trajectory north through the base carried the rail straight towards the heart of our newly built petrochemical plant. Obviously running track through the middle wasn't an option, so just before the factory we dropped in a T-junction and turned the line east towards the Spire Coast. What that gave us was a clean straight shot across the map. The trade-off though? We were building almost entirely in free air. Normally this early in the game I don't put a lot of thought into aesthetics. Most of the time it's about function first, looks later. But a stretch of track hanging in the sky with nothing under it just didn't feel right. If we were going to sell the illusion, we had to give it some weight. So the solution became turning the entire span into a massive train trestle. Every other blueprint support was extended all the way to the ground, anchoring the trestle, and between those anchors we built arch supports out of steel frames, steel cable, and chrome-plated roof pieces. The end result was believable, and it gave the trestle a character of its own. Not planned and not cosmetic fluff, but something that emerged naturally out of the need to make a floating line feel like a real piece of infrastructure. From the Spire Coast trestle, the line continued east until it reached the base of the mesa dividing the Dune Desert from the coast. At that point, we split the track in two. One branch climbed up the mesa, looping around to the south so we'd have access to that plateau for future builds. The other wound its way down through the canyon before leveling out onto the Dune Desert floor. By the time those ramps were finished, the rail line stretched clean across the map. What started as short connections between local projects has grown into a continuous spine tying multiple regions together. Building through open air forced us to get creative with supports, and while it slowed things down, the result was a network that looked sturdy and intentional instead of just floating track. With that rail connection in place, the focus moved to the next major goal, beginning construction of the Parthenon replica in the Dune Desert. The first step was bringing the line directly to the build site, roughly the center of what would become the north side, the back of the structure. From there, everything else could be oriented outward. The Parthenon itself would sit on top of a raised acropolis, just like the real one. This base isn't just cosmetic, it has function built in. An interior floor sits high on the platform, designed as the main train hall. This level will house all of the stations, freight platforms, and rail-related infrastructure needed to tie the site into the larger network. Beneath it, open to the sand, lies a cavernous understructure. That lower space will eventually store miners, refineries, and much of the raw processing chain as we can reasonably fit below the monument. As for the Parthenon itself, the proportions of the entire structure were dictated from the very beginning by the size of the columns. Since they're the defining feature, they had to look right first and everything else would follow from that choice. So after some experimenting, each column was set at 3 tiles across, about 24 in-game meters. To keep the spacing true to scale, we left another 3 tiles between them, which immediately locked in the rhythm of the layout. From there, the footprint defined itself. a perimeter of 17 by 8 columns with a double row forming the front facade. The result is a layout that fixes a scale in place and sets the tone for just how monumental this build is going to be. But before we could even think about marble columns and sweeping steps, there was an obvious bottleneck to address: concrete. At first I figured I could make a few trips back and forth to our established supply, hauling enough to keep construction moving. But after just a couple of hauls across the map, it was clear this wasn't sustainable. The Parthenon was going to be an enormous sink for concrete, and dragging it in by hand wasn't going to cut it. The first step towards solving it was simple enough. I dropped a row of temporary constructors at each of the local limestone nodes. That gave us a nearby source and kept the build moving, for a little while. But the more column segments I set down, the more the numbers piled up. Each individual column piece chewed through nearly 700 concrete, and the top caps demanded close to 1,000. With these requirements, the little local lines barely scratched the surface. So I pushed farther. I converted every nearby node into a fully sharded wet concrete refinery, maximizing throughput as far as the recipes allowed. But even then, the construction pace still outstripped production. Every time I turned around, the supply bins were empty again. That's when I had to admit that the scale of this project was going to require something extra. So the workaround ended up being brute force, but also effective. I stacked several industrial storage containers on site and left the game running overnight to fill them. It felt a little cheaty, but compared to outright spawning items in with the console, it was still fair play. The sim did the work, and the machines churned away, and by morning we had enough of a buffer to keep the Parthenon project moving. So now, with the supplies buffered and ready, construction of the structure itself could truly get underway. The first task was setting up the train platform, and I placed it right at the current level of the rail line, making sure it would tie directly into the network we had already laid down. From there, I raised the top of the acropolis high enough to clear the train stations below, leaving plenty of headroom to run belts along the ceiling later if needed. That elevation set the footprint for the floor above, so I began building out the top surface while marking out the future columns with red-colored tiles. The red markers made it easy to see the grid taking shape as the perimeter came together. Next, I extended the sloped ramps from the edges of the acropolis down to the desert floor. These defined the outer lines of the structure and gave the whole foundation a more natural sloped profile, tying the monumental scale of the Parthenon into the terrain itself. And finally, it was just a matter of filling in the train floor to its full extent. Once that was done, the acropolis was complete. A solid foundation with room above for the Parthenon proper, and space below for miners, refining infrastructure, and all the train-related systems that will make this structure more than just a decoration. The next step was beginning work on the columns, though, in truth, some of this overlapped with the acropolis construction. It's a good practice to partially build different sections as you go, just to get a sense of how the final structure will come together before committing fully to one. So to build the columns, I started by creating a partial segment in the blueprint maker. To get the octagonal shape, I clipped half foundations over each other, overlapping them slightly to form the spines of the column. Once I was happy with the pattern, I began stacking them upward, one segment at a time. To determine the final height, I did the math against the proportions of the real Parthenon, then I added about 15 to 20% more, giving just a little extra headroom for the factory interior. That extra space will make it easier to house machines and keep the inside functional without throwing off the overall look of the replica. For the top of the columns, I designed a special cap block to represent the squared transition where the shaft meets with the entablature. Building upward went smoothly for a while thanks to staggered heights, which I could easily traverse with the jetpack. But as the structure climbed higher, I eventually had to add a ladder just to keep up with construction. With the columns finally in place, the next step was tying them together with the entablature, the massive frame that would carry the roof. Structurally, the entablature is hollow, which makes it practical for routing belts, but from the outside, it reads as a solid stone beam, preserving the monumental weight and presence of the Parthenon. It's the piece that unifies the forest of columns into a single structure and locks the proportions together, setting the stage for the roof to rise above it. That hollow space will not go wasted. My plan is to use the columns and the frame as the backbone for logistics inside the Parthenon. The idea is to do as much refining as possible on the ground floor, then push intermediate products upwards through the interior of the columns. From there, they'll be transferred onto the top floor, refined further across multiple stages, and then cascade downward floor by floor until they reach the bottom level. And at the very base, everything terminates in storage and dimensional uploaders. That one-way flow keeps item transfers clean and consistent, always moving downward without ever needing to puncture the bottom floor. It gives the building both order and efficiency, while making sure the monumental exterior isn't compromised by messy beltwork. With the entablature frame locked across the tops of the columns, the next step was the roof itself. I began at the outer edges, laying foundations inward row by row, each one climbing slightly higher to create the signature slope. Piece by piece, the span closed in towards the middle until the two slopes met cleanly along the ridge. At either end, I capped the gables with angled foundations to seal the geometry, giving the Parthenon its recognizable profile. By the time the last foundation snapped into place, the exterior stood complete. The columns, the frame, and now the roof all tied together into a single monumental structure. From the distance, it read exactly as intended, a massive replica rising out of the desert, a landmark that not only dominates the skyline but also sets the stage for the factory that will fill its interior. And that's where we're going to call it for today. A huge amount of progress done, and yet not a single production machine placed. Sometimes that's how it goes in Satisfactory. Before the factory comes the framework. These support structures might not be producing items yet, but they're what makes it possible to scale up into something far greater. Next time we'll start filling in the interior, building the hidden factory that sits inside the columns and across the acropolis floor. That's where the real production begins, and where all this architectural groundwork pays off. And until then, thanks for watching episode 4 of the AtroKraft Satisfactory Megabase project. If you've enjoyed the series so far, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and check out the Twitch streams where all of this is built live. We'll see you next time.